In the 12th century, poets invented an entire philosophy of love based on the principle that you should never actually be with the person you desire. In ancient Greece, falling in love was classified as a form of divine insanity. In 1774, a single novel about heartbreak caused a psychological epidemic across Europe. Love has been making people lose their minds for as long as we've been writing things down. So why does right now feel like the worst it's ever been? Everyone agrees that modern dating is broken. The right thinks feminism destroyed it. The left thinks patriarchy poisoned it. Some want to go back to arranged marriages. Others want to abolish the institution altogether. They disagree on everything except the diagnosis. Something has gone horribly wrong. We live in an age of what I've heard called romantic nihilism. A generation ago, the dominant cultural story was that love was a fairy tale. You'd meet the one, the music would swell, and you'd live happily ever after. That story collapsed, and instead of replacing it with something more honest, we just gave up. We swung from blind faith in love to straight into total cynicism about it. No middle ground, no nuance, just love is a lie and a shrug. But here's what's strange. If you look at history, love has always been a little unhinged. The ancient Greeks thought falling in love was a form of divine madness. Eros didn't whisper gently in your ear. He shot you with an arrow, and the wound made you lose your mind. Plato called it theomania, a madness sent by the gods. You were not in control. That was the whole point. And this wasn't treated as a problem to be solved. It was accepted as part of the deal. When Goethe published The Sorrows of Young Werther in 1774, a novel about a young man so destroyed by unrequited love that he kills himself, the book triggered a wave of copycats across Europe. Young men dressed like Werther. They carried copies of the book to their graves. It was a continent-wide epidemic of romantic despair. And while authorities were horrified, nobody was particularly surprised. Of course, love could do that to a person. What else would you expect? We've lost that acceptance. Today, if love makes you irrational, we pathologize it. We call it codependency, or anxious attachment, or trauma bonding. We've built an entire vocabulary for making the ordinary madness of love sound like a clinical disorder. And look, some of those terms are genuinely useful, but the cumulative effect is a culture that treats any emotional intensity in love as a red flag rather than a feature of the experience. So if love has always been chaotic, why does it feel uniquely painful right now? Why does this particular moment in history feel like the worst time to be looking for love? We are the same creatures who carved love poems into Sumerian clay tablets 4,000 years ago. What changed is the framework. Over the last few centuries, we slowly dismantled the communal, spiritual, and philosophical structures that once surrounded love, and we replaced them with a set of expectations that are, when you actually examine them, flatly impossible. That's what this video is about. We're going to walk through piece by piece the specific philosophical and historical pressures that have turned modern love into something so agonizing. And more importantly, we're going to talk about what the ancients, the philosophers, and the poets understood about love that we've forgotten. Think about what we actually expect from a romantic partner today. We expect them to be our best friend, our therapist, our financial co-pilot, our co-parent, our sexual match, our intellectual equal, our emotional safe space, and on top of all that, the person who gives our life meaning. That last one is the killer, because for most of human history, meaning came from somewhere else entirely. For thousands of years, the big existential questions, why am I here, what happens when I die, how do I live a good life, were answered by religion, by community, by tribe and tradition. You didn't need your wife or husband to solve the riddle of existence for you. God handled that. Your village handled that. Your place in a web of social obligation and shared ritual handled that. Love was wonderful when it showed up, but it was one thread in a much larger fabric. Now pull that fabric away. Religious participation has been declining across the West for decades. Civic institutions have hollowed out. The old frameworks of meaning have either collapsed or lost their authority for huge numbers of people. And into that vacuum, we have inserted romantic love. We've taken a human being, a finite, flawed, mortal person, and asked them to perform the role that God and community once filled. We have made our partners into secular saviors, and then we wonder why they keep failing us. There's an old myth that captures how deep this expectation runs. In Plato's Symposium, the comedian Aristophanes tells a story about the origin of love. He says that humans were originally round creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. They were powerful and complete, and this made the gods nervous. So Zeus split them in half, scattering the pieces across Earth. Ever since, each one of us has been wandering the world looking for our other half, and when we find them, we cling to them with a desperate, wordless longing to be whole again. It's a beautiful myth. Aristophanes himself is half joking when he tells it, but somewhere along the way, we took this poetic image and turned it into a literal expectation. We call it finding the one, the idea that there is a single person on Earth who will complete you, who will fill every gap in your soul, and that your job is simply to locate them. And once you do, everything clicks into place. No effort required. This is an insane amount of pressure to put on another human being. You are essentially asking one person to be your everything, and when they inevitably fall short, because they are a person and not a deity, the conclusion isn't, I expected too much. The conclusion is, they must not be the one, and you go back to searching. But the damage goes deeper than just overloading your partner, because when you expect the romantic love to carry all your emotional weight, you start neglecting every other form of love in your life. And this brings us to something the ancient Greeks understood far better than we do. The Greeks didn't have one word for love, they had several, and they took the distinction seriously. Eros was passionate, romantic, sexual love, the fire, the longing. But alongside Eros, they place enormous value on philia, which is usually translated as friendship, but that translation undersells it. Philia was the deep bond between people who shared a life together, who showed up for one another, who built something through loyalty and time. Aristotle called philia one of the most essential ingredients of a good life. He wrote more about friendship in his Nicomachean Ethics than he did about romantic love. For Aristotle, a life without deep friendship was barely a life at all. And here's where modernity has quietly gutted us. Adult friendships are in free fall. The data on this is stark. The number of Americans who say they have no close friends has roughly quadrupled since 1990. People work long hours, move more often, socialize less, spend more time online. The old institutions that used to generate friendships almost automatically, churches, unions, lodges, neighborhood bars, have either disappeared or thinned out. And because we've lost those bonds, we've loaded everything onto the one relationship we still maintain, the romantic one. Your partner is now expected to be your lover, your confidant, your adventure buddy, your emotional support, your social life, and your best friend, all rolled into one person. You used to have a village for that. Now you have a spouse in a group chat that nobody replies to. This is the first great pressure of modern love. We have taken the role once shared across an entire community of relationships and concentrated it into a single point of failure. And when that single point buckles, we don't blame the structure, we blame the person. So where did all these expectations come from? If you trace the story back far enough, you arrive at a surprising answer. The version of romantic love that dominates Western culture, the swooning, the longing, the idea that true love should be overwhelming and slightly tragic, was largely invented, and we can point to roughly where and when it happened. In the 12th century, in the courts of southern France, a group of poets called the troubadours began writing a new kind of love poetry. Before them, love in European culture was mostly practical. Marriage was a business arrangement. Sexual desire was acknowledged, but not particularly romanticized. The troubadours changed all of that. They wrote about love as worship. The beloved, almost always as an unattainable noble woman, was placed on a pedestal so high she was practically divine. The lover suffered beautifully at a distance, and that suffering was the point. Fulfillment would have ruined the poem. The longing was the art. A chaplain named Andreas Capellanus went so far as to write a treatise called De Amore, On Love, which laid out formal rules for this new game. Love must be secret. Love must be difficult. Love must involve jealousy. True love between married people is essentially impossible, because marriage is an obligation and love must be freely given. He wrote this around 1184, and whether he meant it sincerely or as satire is still debated. Either way, his rules became the template. Now, the crucial thing to understand is that courtly love was a literary performance. It was an aristocratic game played in a very specific social context. The troubadours were not writing self-help books. They were writing poetry for entertainment and patronage. Their vision of love was never meant to be a blueprint for how ordinary people should actually conduct their relationships. But ideas have a way of escaping their original context. The courtly love tradition filtered into the romance literature of the following centuries, into Dante's obsession with Beatrice, into Petrarch's sonnets to Laura, into Shakespeare's tragedies. Each generation inherited the basic template. Love should be intense, idealizing, dramatic, and at least a little bit doomed. And each generation forgot a little more about the fact that this was an artistic invention, not a description of reality. Still, for most of history, this poetic ideal and the practical reality of marriage existed in completely separate lanes. You might read about Lancelot and Guinevere, but you married whoever your father arranged for you. And the marriage was about land, alliances, and survival. Love, if it showed up at all, was a pleasant bonus. Nobody expected it. The historian Stephanie Coontz traces the critical shift in her book Marriage, a History. She argues that sometime in the 18th and 19th centuries, Western culture did something unprecedented. It took the troubadour ideal of passionate, all-consuming love and made it the foundation of marriage. For the first time, people began to believe that you should only marry someone you were deeply, romantically in love with. And Koontz's argument is that this single change, which felt like progress and liberation, immediately destabilized the entire institution. Because the moment you say that love is the reason for marriage, every marriage where love fades or fails becomes a crisis. Before, a loveless marriage was the norm. Now it was a tragedy. So here we are, inheriting two things simultaneously. From the troubadours, we inherited an image of love that is idealizing, dramatic, and built on a beauty of unfulfilled longing. From the modern era, we inherited the demand that this kind of love be the basis of our most practical, everyday partnership. We welded a 12th century fantasy onto an 18th century institution and called it normal. And then we handed the whole arrangement to dating apps and wondered why everyone is miserable. Let's talk about how people used to meet. If you lived in a medieval village or 19th century market town, or honestly any human settlement before about 1995, your romantic options were drawn from a small known pool of people. You grew up alongside them. You knew their families. You watched them lose their temper at a neighbor or fumble through an awkward adolescence. By the time you were old enough to marry, there were few illusions left. You knew this person's flaws before you ever held their hand. And this wasn't a disadvantage. It was, in a strange way, the foundation of realistic love. You went into a relationship with open eyes. You chose someone despite their flaws, or maybe because of a few of them. And the work of love was the slow, unglamorous process of building a shared life with a person you already understood to be imperfect. Now consider what happens on a dating app. You see a photograph of a stranger. You read a few curated sentences about their personality. Maybe you exchange some texts. And then you meet in person, knowing almost nothing real about who they are. Your brain, faced with this vacuum of information, does what brains always do. It fills in the gaps, and it fills them in generously. The French writer Stendhal described this phenomenon back in 1822, long before anyone had dreamed of a smartphone. In his book On Love, he introduced a concept called crystallization. He borrowed the image from the salt mines of Salzburg. Miners would toss a bare tree branch into the depths of a mine, and when they pulled it out weeks later, it would be encrusted with glittering salt crystals, transformed from something ordinary into something dazzling. Stendhal argued that the human mind does the same thing to the people we desire. We take a real, ordinary person and unconsciously decorate them with imagined perfections. Every ambiguity becomes a virtue. Every silence becomes depth. Every blank space on the canvas gets filled in with exactly what we want to see. This has always been a feature of early attraction. Stendhal knew that, but in his world, crystallization had natural limits. You lived in the same city as the person, you shared social circles. Reality had a way of intervening before the crystal image grew too far from the truth. Dating apps have removed those limits entirely. We now perform crystallization on complete strangers, at scale, at speed. You might crystallize 3 different people in a single evening, building elaborate mental portraits of humans you have never actually met. And because the image in your head is your creation, tailored to your exact desires, it is almost always more appealing than any real person could be. Which brings us to the ick. If you're not familiar with the term the ick, it's that sudden, visceral wave of disgust or lost attraction that hits when a person you're dating does something minor and human. They chew with their mouth open, they run awkwardly, they pronounce a word wrong, they're too eager or too aloof, or they order the wrong drink. The feeling is immediate and total, as if a switch has been flipped, and it's almost impossible to reason your way out of it. One moment you are interested, the next you're repulsed. The internet treats the ick like a mysterious force, something almost supernatural, but there's nothing mysterious about it. The ick is what happens when crystallization shatters. You built an image of this person in your head, an image made of your own projections and desires, and then the real person did something that the image never would have done. The gap between fantasy and reality cracks open, and instead of gently adjusting your expectations, your brain interprets the mismatch as a threat. Something is wrong with this person. They aren't who you thought they were. Which is true, of course. They never were. They were always just a person, and you were the one who turned them into a crystal sculpture. The deeper problem is what the ick reveals about our expectations. We have come to expect that real compatibility should feel effortless from the very first moment. If there's friction, if something feels off, if the other person surprises you in a way that doesn't perfectly align with the fantasy, then the whole thing must be wrong. We've absorbed the courtly love premise without realizing it. That love should be instant recognition, a lock clicking into a key, and when the key doesn't slide in smoothly, we don't question the lock. We throw the key away and look for a new one. And why wouldn't you throw it away? After all, there are thousands more keys waiting for you. All you have to do is open your phone. This is the part of the problem that gets talked about the most, but rarely with the philosophical depth it deserves. Everyone knows in a vague sort of way that having too many options makes choosing harder, but the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard diagnosed the exact mechanics of this trap almost 200 years ago, and his description is so precise it reads like he is writing about Hinge. Kierkegaard described human existence as moving through stages. At the first and most dangerous, he called the aesthetic stage. A person living in the aesthetic stage organizes their life around novelty, pleasure, and the avoidance of boredom. They sample experiences. They keep their options open. They refuse to be pinned down because commitment means closing doors, and closing doors means losing the thrilling sense that anything is still possible. The aesthete floats through life, always tasting, never swallowing. The second stage, Kierkegaard called the ethical stage. This is where a person finally chooses. They commit to something, a vocation, a relationship, a set of responsibilities, and in doing so, they accept limitation. They give up the fantasy of infinite possibility in exchange for the depth that only comes from staying with one thing long enough to know it fully. Kierkegaard believed that real selfhood, real identity, only forms in the ethical stage. The aesthete, for all their freedom, never becomes anyone in particular. They are always browsing, never building. Now look at modern dating culture through that lens. The entire architecture of dating apps is designed to keep you in the aesthetic stage permanently. Every profile is a new possibility. Every swipe is a micro thrill of novelty. The interface literally gamifies the refusal to choose. And the implicit promise running underneath all of it is, don't settle. The perfect match is one more swipe away. You haven't found them yet because you haven't looked hard enough, or swiped far enough, or optimized your profile well enough. Keep going. Kierkegaard had a term for where this leads. He called it the despair of possibility. It's a specific kind of misery that comes from having so many options you become paralyzed. You can't choose because choosing one thing means giving up everything else. And so you hover in a state of permanent potential, never actualizing anything, never building anything, growing older while your life remains a rough draft that never gets finished. The painful irony is that Kierkegaard knew this trap from the inside. In 1840, he fell in love with a young woman named Regine Olsen. By all accounts, including his own, she was the love of his life. He proposed, she accepted, and then about a year later, he broke it off. The reasons he gave were tangled and tortured. He told Regine he wasn't fit for marriage. He told himself committing to her would compromise his intellectual and spiritual calling. He agonized over it in his journals for years afterward. Some scholars think he was afraid that the mundane obligations of married life would flatten his genius. Others think he was simply terrified of the vulnerability that comes with choosing one person and staying. For whatever reason, Kierkegaard spent the rest of his life circling back to Regine. She appears thinly disguised throughout his writing. He never married. He never fully moved on. The philosopher who wrote more brilliantly than anyone about the necessity of commitment could not bring himself to commit. He understood the ethical stage perfectly, he just couldn't enter it. There is something uncomfortably familiar about this. How many people right now are sitting across from someone kind and interesting, someone they genuinely like, and quietly thinking, but what if there's someone better? The person in front of them is real. The someone better is imaginary. And yet the imaginary person often wins, because an imaginary person can be anything you want them to be. They never chew loudly, they never disappoint you, they exist in a permanent state of crystallized perfection, right up until the moment they become real and disappoint you too. The poet Sylvia Plath captured this paralysis in an image that has become almost unbearably relevant. In The Bell Jar, she describes a fig tree, with every branch representing a different possible life. One fig is a happy marriage, another is a brilliant career, another is travel, another is adventure, another is family. She sees herself sitting at the base of the tree, starving, because she wants every single fig and cannot bear to choose just one. And while she sits there, unable to decide, the figs begin to rot and drop at her feet, one by one. That is the despair of possibility. That is what it looks like to have everything available and nothing chosen, and dating apps have turned it into a lifestyle. So where does this leave us? We have inherited an image of love that was invented by 12th century poets, bolted onto an 18th century institution, overloaded with the spiritual weight of a dying religious culture, filtered through a technology that gamifies indecision, and wrapped in a set of cultural expectations so contradictory that no human being could satisfy them all at once. We want our partner to be safe and exciting, familiar and mysterious, our best friend and our greatest passion. We want them to give us stability and also keep us on our toes. We want unconditional acceptance and also to be challenged and pushed to grow. But these desires are fundamentally in tension with each other. Healthy love requires holding both sides of the tension without demanding that one of them disappear. The ancients understood this better than we give them credit for. The Greeks didn't collapse all forms of love into a single relationship. As mentioned earlier, they had eros for passion, philia for deep friendship, storge for family bonds, and agape for selfless devotion. A good life meant cultivating all of these in different relationships with different people. No single person was expected to be everything. The emotional portfolio was diversified, and when one bond faltered, the others held. We need to rebuild something like that. We need to stop treating romantic love as a total solution to the problem of being alive, and start treating it as one essential thread in a larger fabric. That means investing in friendships with the same seriousness we bring to dating. It means building community in a culture that has made community almost accidentally impossible. It means recognizing that the loneliness epidemic and the dating crisis are the same crisis viewed from different angles. And perhaps most importantly, we need to change the way we think about what love is. The dominant metaphor right now is consumerist. We talk about love as something you find, like a product on a shelf. You browse, you compare, you read reviews, you select the option with the best features, and if it breaks, you return it and get a new one. This is the language of the marketplace applied to the most intimate dimension of human life, and it is quietly poisoning everything. Aristotle offered a different metaphor. He argued that virtues, the qualities that make a person good, are not things you are born with or stumble upon. They are skills. You become courageous by practicing courage. You become generous by practicing generosity. There is no shortcut. There is no hack. There is only the slow, repetitive, often unglamorous work of doing the thing until you get better at it. Love works the same way. You learn patience by being patient with a real person who tests your patience. You learn forgiveness by forgiving someone who has actually hurt you. You learn vulnerability by being vulnerable with someone who might not handle it perfectly. These capacities cannot be developed in the abstract through self-help books or therapy worksheets or solo reflection. They can only be developed in the living, breathing, and sometimes infuriating presence of another person. This is the idea of mutual construction, the notion that identity and wholeness are things that get built between people in the friction and vulnerability of an actual relationship. You don't become your best self in solitude and then go find someone worthy of the finished product. You become your best self in the presence of someone who loves the unfinished version. The ancient world understood this almost instinctively. The modern world has largely forgotten it. And in its place, we've put the isolating demand that you must be perfect yourself alone before you're allowed to be loved. This is the way out of romantic nihilism. We stop waiting for love to arrive fully formed and frictionless, because it never has and it never will. We lower the godlike expectations we have placed on our partners, and we spread the weight of our emotional lives across the broader community of relationships that humans were always meant to maintain. We accept that the ick is our own projection shattering, that the endless scroll is Kierkegaard's despair wearing a friendly interface, and that the person sitting across from us at dinner will never match the crystallized image in our heads, because they are better than that. They are real. Love has always been a little bit mad. The Greeks knew that. Goethe knew that. The troubadours turned it into an art form. The madness is the price of admission, and it has always been worth paying. What we cannot afford is the modern delusion that love should be easy, effortless, and perfectly optimized. That delusion is the thing that is actually killing us. The way forward is the old way. Commit to someone imperfect. Build something together that neither of you could build alone. Let the friction shape you. Let the difficulty be the point. And stop swiping long enough to let a real person become real to you. Thank you so much for watching. This was Folks of Yore. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment about your thoughts. Thanks again. See you next time.